Ajay Banga, President of the World Bank. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. We are meeting on the heels of the US presidential election results. We're not going to talk about politics right now, but clearly the results will have an impact on the world, particularly, arguably, on developing economies, given that what the next Trump administration may usher in is tariffs, inflation, a stronger dollar. Which is going to potentially pose troubles for those countries, not least in terms of their ability to repay debt. This is happening at a time in which emerging market debt is at a record high, and emerging market debt as a percentage of GDP is also at a record high levels, 245% in the second quarter of this year. The World Bank is working with many of these developing economies. Are you concerned?
Well, so first of all, the whole debt issue is an issue that goes back before any elections. And this is the challenge that a number of the emerging markets have had, where they borrowed when interest rates were lower, and also when the dollar was relatively and the euro was weaker. And then, they kind of got hit by a double whammy, both higher interest rates and higher currencies over time. And essentially, as you know, the World Bank and the IMF and a group of countries under the G20 Common Framework came together to work on this global sovereign debt roundtable. Our role there is you create a debt sustainability analysis for each country with the IMF, and then we work with the Paris Club, the bilateral creditors, and now commercial creditors as well, and try and find a way to work these countries through it. And 4 countries from Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia are going through this process. Actually, Ghana and Zambia have almost worked their way through the process, and Chad and Ethiopia are coming through. And in the meanwhile, we're the ones who are giving them money over the last 4 years as a lifeline, 16 billion to these 4 countries, about half in grants and half in deeply concessional lending. So that's kind of the way that this system is working on debt. It worries me because they're spending more on debt repayment than they are on education, health, and infrastructure put together. So I'm not sure that this is something that is going to change directly because of a new administration or otherwise. I think this is something we really need to work our way through as a group of countries and businesses with them.
Okay, so the problem is already there.
It's already there.
Perhaps new conditions may make it worse. But so you were talking about...
Sure, because it depends on whether interest rates go up or come down over time. You see, a lot of this is based on the fact that people think that XYZ action will lead to different kinds of results. The reality right now is that it looks like interest rates across the world are actually peaking and coming down. It's the pace of reduction that might change, either faster or slower. If the interest rates do come down, clearly it becomes easier for them to bear the debt burden. On the other hand, if they don't, then that's a different issue.
Okay, so let's say a lot of uncertainty. That's definitely something we can say on top of an already really complex and delicate situation.
Yes.
Now, you talked about what the World Bank can do in terms of, for example, deeply concessional lending and other products. But is lending anyway the solution here? Because of course we are seeing that not only a lot of these countries are spending more in debt interest payments and principal repayments than they are, as you rightly pointed out, on health and education, but also when we are looking at, for example, activities in terms of trying to convene the private sector, which is something that you are also trying to do. That things are complex there as well, because then the private sector tends to be quite timid when it comes to emerging markets. But then those that actually are exposed to those markets, particularly we have seen some commentators looking at data from 2023, they noticed that those investors were actually receiving more in interest repayments than they were in terms of inflows into those markets.
The first part of it is that, remember, of the 16 billion we've given these 4 specific countries, half is grants. That's not lending. There's no interest repayment. There's no principal repayment. It's pure grant. The other half is deeply concessional. And the idea of this is to keep their net positive flows growing by a lot so they can keep their lifeline going to keep working. But there's other things you can do. You can do things like debt for development swaps. So, for example, with a certain country in Africa right now, we're working out that if we can use our guarantee products, which we've put together recently, and use that to help to package their existing debt on education loans to a lower level, save 100 million, and take that 100 million and put it back to work on education, a debt for development swap, so to say. Those are the kinds of things that can work. In addition, in the case of Ghana, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, the four going through this, there is also a common agreement between the creditors to write down their debt to a certain number of cents on the dollar. So there's many things involved in this debt sort of roundtable that's working together on this. Your topic about the private sector. I've been talking about the private sector in two different contexts. One context is, can we look at the private sector in the middle income countries for renewable energy in specific? That's where the private sector lab was going. The reason why we picked renewable energy in middle income countries is that if you don't bend the curve on the energy emission growth in middle income countries over the coming 10 to 15 years, their natural growth of population and income will drive energy consumption there to a point where their emissions from that will overtake what you reduce in the developed world. So it's really an issue of making sure that we do the right thing in those countries as well. That's where the private sector in theory could also have it easier to go in because they are more predictable markets. There are local capital markets. There is a degree of regulatory reform that's already happened in a number of these countries. The smaller emerging markets, the ones where private sector capital from overseas tends to be timid, that is a different problem. Very often in those smaller markets, the private sector that will play in those countries is either local private sector, small and medium-sized enterprises, or regional private sector from that area who understands that country and understands the risk of working there. It's very unlikely that you'll attract large global investors into some of these smaller emerging markets as a way to get the private sector to come in. You see what I mean? So it's a question of working with the private sector in the context of the country as compared to one size fits all.
Is there anything else that is scalable that can be used short of just giving grants?
For debt.
For debt.
Yeah,
yes.
Well, those debt for development swaps, these nature swaps, there is something there. Are they scalable to the extent of tens of billions of dollars? Probably not. Are they scalable to the extent of hundreds of millions of dollars? Yes. And so they help because along with the grants that we provide and along with the rewrite of debt that happens through things like the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable and the G20 Common Framework, that put together as a good solution for these countries. You will see that Zambia and Ghana are coming out of their situation relatively set to take the next levels of growth in what they can do.
Now, something else that private sector investors and bankers usually lament when they've been invited and looking at developing economies is regulatory certainty.
Yes.
I know this is something you're also working on. I mean,
yes.
But what, with some frustration, perhaps, what can an institution like the World Bank realistically do to really influence a positive outcome?
So one of the first things that came out of the private sector lab, these 15 CEOs who got together to talk to us, was that regulatory certainty would give them a great deal of reassurance about putting their money to work in these countries. I'm talking about those middle-income countries at that time. And there's no doubt that we can help because remember, we as the World Bank work very closely with finance ministers, economy ministers, and leaders of these countries because we are both a money bank for them, but even more so, we're a knowledge bank for them in terms of policies, and our reports like Be Ready or Women in Business and Law provide a non-subjective platform to be able to evaluate the processes that countries are undertaking to move along. We also give development policy lending to a country. Very often that is connected to pay for results, what we call P4R. And today almost half of the money we put to work at the World Bank comes with a P4R attachment. So to give you a concrete example, we have announced that we will do 300 million connections, people in Africa connected to power by 2030. Some of that will be fixing of utilities and transmission lines, but a lot of it will be new distributed solar energy, for example, where when we put up such a distributed solar energy plant, we'll also put up a cell phone tower to be able to connect people to the internet as well as to power. Now, one of the first things that's required there is that private money will have to come in along with money from IDA, the World Bank, and governments. The government money, because they don't have fiscal room. Remember, we were discussing debt when we started. The IMF and us are working together to use the IMF's RST to help with the fiscal room there. IDA will provide the money that we need to provide. And then there is the private sector. The private sector will not come without this regulatory reform. So in January, the end of January, 26th and 27th, in Tanzania, we are hosting a Heads of State Summit for 15 countries currently from Africa who are all preparing an energy compact. And the first thing they're putting together, the leadership of those countries, finance ministers and leaders, is what regulatory reform are they willing to commit to ensure that the private sector feels that this is a worthwhile risk for them to take to bring the money to work. And I think that kind of work, creating an energy compact plan from these countries, which we can help them draw up, along with foundations and others, is to help them say, how do I recreate the regulatory environment in my country to make it possible for the private sector to come in addition to public money.
Okay, so your role and that
it's a catalyst for that.
It's a catalyst,
and a knowledge,
you're kind of nudging and
providing best practice.